Good evening and a warm welcome to African Perspective with me, Aldrin Simpier. On the show this evening, African heads of state prepare to descend on Addis Ababa for the African Union Summit. We go live to Ethiopia. And who will be representing Malawi at that particular summit? The country's constitutional court sets aside the 2019 election of President Peter Mutharika. But what does this say about the credibility of observer missions? Remember, you can interact with us on Twitter using the handle @AfricanSpac1. And let's start off with that story. As African heads of state convene at the African Union Summit, they will discuss the AU 2020's theme, silencing the guns. Conflict and instability still present serious challenges across the continent. Ethiopia says it is ready to host the summit despite the rapid spread of the coronavirus. The Addis Ababa City Administration, in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, has intensified its medical surveillance at the airport. Let's go straight now to Addis Ababa, where we speak to Sarah Kimani. Sarah, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Let's start off there with that particular issue around the coronavirus. Any fears around the city at this point?
Well, there are no fears, and the government has moved to reassure visitors and also its citizens that everything has been put in place to ensure that everybody feels safe and everybody leaves the country without either entering into the country with the virus or living with it. The other airport surveillance measures have been put, checking temperatures, and especially for people coming from China and the Far East, the surveillance has been increased. Just like in the rest of East Africa, there is quite heavy traffic of air transportation between China and the East African region. So quite some high surveillance ongoing in Addis.
Okay, so this would include, of course, surveillance, I guess, at airports as well as possibly all these hotels, for instance, where some of the guests will be staying?
Well, at the moment, most of it has been concentrated around the airports. We haven't seen much at the hotels, but we expect that probably at the African Union headquarters, there will be more surveillance.
Okay, and speaking about the African Union headquarters, the theme for this year's summit being silencing the guns, creating a conducive condition for Africa's development. And we have been saying that according to Agenda 2063, it has been said that by the year 2020, the guns on the continent must be silent. And we know what's happening in the Saharan region, for instance, and what's happening in Libya. How confident are member states ahead of this particular summit that the guns will be silenced, or would they move at least one step closer to the silencing of those guns, whether it be at a different within a different year?
Well, what they agree is that the guns may not fall completely silent this year, which is a deadline that they had set themselves. But they agree that in most of the countries where there is conflict, there are peace processes that are ongoing, most of them led by Africans themselves. So they feel that they're taking matters into their hands. A lot of people, of course, will have their eyes on South Sudan, which later this month should be saying the final peace agreement. The Sahel region is among the regions that will top the agenda of the meeting because extremist groups are reigning terror there. But of course, the issue of extremism will be given priority. But tied to the issue of violent extremism will be the issue of migration, because one of the arguments that the African Union has is that as long as young people do not have jobs and they are migrating and dying in the Mediterranean Sea, then they become very easy targets for people recruiting for these violent extremist groups. So they will be talking about a center for migration, which will be able to discuss issues of how migration can be stopped, how governments can create more jobs, and also issues of integrating youth in the development agenda of the continent.
Sure. And as the President of South Africa takes over the chairmanship, what are some of the people saying and expecting from him?
Well, security will definitely be top of the agenda because after a very long time of quiet in some of the areas, especially in the West African region, there is a lot of flare-ups of conflicts, and so security will continue to feature top of the agenda. It will also be a time now for South Africa to take up the issue of the African continent of free trade area, to see to it that it is implemented, that laws that need to be put in place so that the AfCFTA can take effect completely, then can do that. But South Africa will also be taking the chairmanship of the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, very important and linked to silencing the guns, because as long as there is poor governance in any country on the continent, then there is likely to be civil conflict, there is likely to be conflict across borders, and so South Africa will also be looked at as a big brother to see if it can lead the way first by example, having good governance in its own country, but also being the one that leads the way in the peer review mechanism and helping countries hold each other to account in terms of good governance.
Very quickly, Sarah, could this AU summit also present an opportunity to broker a deal between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile River?
Well, we've not heard anything about Egypt and Ethiopia, especially because that has now been dealt with by Washington, and everything has been happening in the U.S., but it's probably likely to come up maybe in closed-door meetings. Okay, then thank you so much. That is Sarah Kimani. They're coming live from Addis Ababa, where the African Union Summit will be taking place, and as we've indicated that the President of South Africa will be taking over as Chairman of the African Union. This is for the duration of the year 2020. Let's move over to this story. Lesotho's First Lady, Ma Ezaya Tabani, has been granted bail after spending the night behind bars. Mrs. Tabani handed herself over to police yesterday after being on the run following allegations that she was involved in the murder of her husband, Prime Minister Tom Tabani's estranged wife, Dipulelo, in 2017. The First Lady also faces an attempted murder charge.
A small magistrate court quickly filled up with journalists and close friends of Mrs. Tabani. A relaxed-looking Mrs. Tabani, clad in her traditional Basotho dress, seshweshwe, seemed calm as the magistrate preferred charges against her. You are said to be a Mosotho woman, 42 years of age. You are charged on 2 counts. The first count is contravening subsection 40, read with subsection 1. On the 14th June or thereabout in the year 2017, you are alleged that at Hammasana or vicinity thereof in the district of Maseru, you, the accused, illegally and intentionally killed one Dipulelo Tabani by shooting at her. On the second count, you, the accused, illegally and intentionally shot one Tato Sibulla, wounding her. You are therefore charged on attempted murder of Tato Sibulla. Are the charges clear? A moment of reckoning, while some close to her could not hold their tears. Mrs. Tabani was quickly whisked away to the female correctional facilities as preparations for her to request bail gets underway. While many were perplexed by the nature of charges preferred, the police commissioner explains the process. Why is she now being accused of pulling the trigger?
Actually, I think the charge will be amended. Actually, it's a prerogative of the prosecutor to amend the charge before the trial actually commences. Due to the sensitive nature of the charges preferred against her, only a higher court may hear her bail application. But police have already confirmed the intention to oppose bail. She will be taken to the Lesotho Correctional Service because the way I understand is that the magistrate has ordered that she should be kept in the Lesotho Correctional Service and pending the application for bail, and actually she will apply for bail at the High Court of Lesotho. Unless an urgent bail application is granted,
Mrs. Tabani is expected to appear before the magistrate court on the 17th February 2020. Rabelang Khatebe, SABC News, Masego, Lesotho.
Zimbabwe's public health facilities continue to deteriorate, and this has sent senior doctors in Zimbabwe on a panic mode. Last year's 4-month-long industrial action by medical practitioners has also worsened an already dire situation. Clinics and hospitals nationwide are battling to provide even the most basic of services. Noma Bolani and Effort Musogiwa filed this report.
There are certain basic things and tests that we should be doing on a daily basis in the central hospitals that we are not able to do. Sometimes you can't do even a full blood count. Sometimes you can't do a urea and electrolytes. And those are the basics. There are other things that we should be able to do as a nation that we can't do.
Senior doctors are opening up about the devastating situation at public health facilities in Zimbabwe.
I can tell you at Parinyatua right now, out of a theatre suite of 13 possible theatres, we can run 3 to 4. Harare Hospital, main theatre suites, 6, a capacity of 6 main theatre, 3, do you guys have 3 or 4? 3 pediatric theatres, they can run 1. Main theatre out of 6, you can run 1. Maternity, Harare Maternity, out of 2, we can run 1. Pillow, out of 10, we're running 2 theatres.
These doctors claim the sector has been in intensive care for almost 2 decades and now faces a total collapse if no funding is made available. The country is now left with less than 10 operational ICU beds for a population of over 14 million.
This is what the population is not realizing. If you are very ill and you need help, you are going to die. That is the bottom line. If you are very ill in Zimbabwe and you need help, particularly if you are not on some medical insurance, not all medical insurance. So it means only 1 to 2% of the population can be assured that they will get some care. The people are on their own. They cannot be treated, let alone to be transported from the rural hospital to a central hospital.
The health practitioners are afraid the poor state of the public health sector will result in avoidable disasters.
We feel it's imperative for the government of Zimbabwe to look at its disease progressions. We now have a double burden of infectious and non-communicable diseases. And a lot of those will require specialist care, will require doctors. These are your strokes, your heart attacks, your cancers. They are increasingly a burden. And these conditions need to be treated in hospitals. And the hospital system is not capable, as it is, of treating conditions which are starting to affect the majority of citizens, whether you are coming you are in rural Zimbabwe, you are in urban Zimbabwe. The burden of disease is growing, but there seems, from what we see, to be no urgency on the part of the administrators to prepare for or to deal with the current conditions or to prepare for the growing burden that is coming. We keep hearing about these accidents. They are going to increase. We keep hearing about the cancer burden. It's increasing. Diabetes, we are eating differently. It's increasing. But BP patients, because of our lifestyle changes, they are increasing. And there is no urgency on the part of the administrators to prepare or to capacitate the practitioners or the hospitals for this burden of disease.
Despite government doctors ending a 4-month industrial action, the situation on the ground has not improved. Hospitals are still poorly resourced. Even the pharmacies don't have drugs. Authorities, however, are shifting the blame.
The current healthcare administration and government inherited a bankrupt system with no healthcare resources, empty warehouses, with no medicines, no surgical sundries, and requiring an annual minimum of at least US dollars 500 million and a separate budget from Treasury to meet the salaries and allowances for a disgruntled workforce with a low morale. This deterioration, honorables, has been going on over the last 20 years, resulting in annual industrial actions.
What is clear is that the impasse between the government and health practitioners is far from being resolved. Although the number of deaths attributed to the industrial action is yet to be ascertained, many fear a lot of the deaths could have been avoided. Noma Polani, SABC News.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta is in the United States for trade talks with President Donald Trump, aiming to becoming the first sub-Saharan country to broker a bilateral agreement with the Trump administration. President Kenyatta is seeking trade assurances from Trump about what happens after the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, ends in 2025 to ensure that Kenya continues to enjoy preferential access to U.S. markets. Nick Harper reports from Washington.
President Uhuru Kenyatta's visit to the United States is very much a charm offensive, explaining why Kenya is a place to invest in and to do business with. The trade relations with the United States are already very sizable. A combined total of $1.2 billion worth of trade and services are exchanged each year between the two countries. And for Kenya, the US is its third largest trading partner, really thanks to AGOA. But President Kenyatta is looking beyond that as that ends in 2025. He wants to achieve a bilateral agreement with the United States to become the first sub-Saharan country to do so. And he's meeting with President Trump on Thursday to try and hammer out that deal. But ahead of that, on Wednesday, he was talking at a think tank here in Washington, D.C. at the Atlantic Council, explaining why Africa is the place for Americans to turn their attention to. And he pointed out that the continent is not just a continent that produces security threats and unregulated migration. He said it had a lot more to offer.
We must begin to look at Africa as the world's biggest opportunity. And I believe that if you can dare to look at it with a fresh eye and with a keen sense of history, we can achieve this. And my presence here today is to say that Kenya can be a key country in converting that opportunity into mutual gain.
He also explained that Africa has vast untapped potential. He pointed to it having the world's youngest and fastest growing workforce, that it has agricultural potential and vast mineral wealth. But President Kenyatta said that he wants to work with countries that hold Kenya's shared ambitions, namely of achieving prosperity, security and growth. But he warned that in order to do that, the world had to ensure that Africa's young people remained engaged and also had gainful employment, because without that, he warned that there was a real threat of growing extremism that he said would leave no corner of the globe untouched. Well, that important meeting with President Trump taking place later on Thursday, and he's hoping that that bilateral trade deal would serve as a model that other countries in Africa would be able to follow on with, that they would also be able to produce their own bilateral agreements with the United States. Nick Harper, SABC News, Washington.
Meanwhile, the late Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi will be buried next week, Wednesday. Moi, the country's longest-serving head of state, died yesterday morning. President Uhuru Kenyatta has declared a period of national mourning to last until the funeral day, while the national flag is flown at half-mast.
In 1978, after the death of Jomo Kenyatta, Moi became Kenya's second president. This, despite resistance from a section of politicians allied to the late Kenyatta, who preferred that the founding father be succeeded by someone from the Kikuyu community. He continued with Kenyatta's policies in what he called Fuata Nyayo, Swahili for following in the steps. In fact, he is popularly known as Nyayo in Kenya. Moi remained popular until 1982 when an attempted military coup saw him change his leadership style. He took this opportunity to fire his opponents and clamp on dissent, banning opposition parties. At the end of the Cold War, Moi seemed to fall out with Western powers, who now considered him a despot. University academics led underground movements that pushed for democratic reforms and the reintroduction of the multi-party system. Their demands were met with heavy-handedness, long detentions without trial, and torture. Faced with growing pressure from the West, which included the withholding of foreign aid to Kenya, Moi announced at a KANU delegates conference in 1991 the repeal of Section 2A of the Constitution, which banned multi-party politics. The following year, he won the country's first multi-party elections amid charges of electoral fraud. Violence then marred the 1997 elections, leading to the deaths of people in areas perceived to be opposition strongholds. His administration was accused of corruption, nepotism, and human rights abuses. A 2007 WikiLeaks report linked Moi and his family to a web of shell companies that were used to loot money from Kenya and stash it abroad. A new constitutional requirement barred him from seeking a third mandate in 2002. Moi sidestepped his then Vice President, Professor George Saitoti, and instead backed Uhuru Kenyatta, son of his predecessor, Jomo Kenyatta, as the KANU presidential candidate. This led to dissent within the party, followed by a mass walkout that saw the opposition uniting to form the National Rainbow Coalition, NAC. After 4 decades as the ruling party, Moi's led KANU was swept from power as NAC's candidate Mwai Kibaki succeeded Moi in December 2002. Moi retreated into quiet retirement, only re-emerging in 2013 when Uhuru Kenyatta, his preferred successor, took over power, this time as a candidate for an opposition coalition known as the Jubilee Alliance Coalition. Moi divorced from his late wife Lena in 1974. He leaves behind 7 children and a personal fortune estimated at $3 billion. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Kenya.
And welcome back. Malawi's main opposition party members took to the streets to celebrate following the country's constitutional court ruling that annulled the May 2019 presidential vote. On Monday, a panel of judges ruled unanimously for new elections to be held within 150 days, a verdict welcomed by the opposition.
Last year's election declared Peter Mutharika a winner, but the court has ordered a rerun after an application from opposition parties citing irregularities. Mutharika, who has been president since 2014, won the election with a 38.6% share of the vote, with opposition party leader Lazarus Chakwera getting 35.4% and Deputy President Saulos Chilima, who formed his own party, with 20.2% in the final tally. Mutharika was declared winner despite complaints of irregularities. The court said the 2019 outcome could not be trusted to represent the will of the people, and also criticized the conduct of the Electoral Commission, which is said was very lacking and demonstrated incompetence.
So what does this ruling tell us about the state of democracy on the African continent? To unpack this, we are now joined in studio by Grant Masterson, who is the senior program head at the Electoral Institute of Sustainable Democracy in Africa. Good evening and welcome to the African Perspective. Let's start off here with that particular question. What does this tell us about democracy on the continent?
Well, it certainly tells us that in Malawi, the courts take their role very seriously. Having seen that they've dissected what happened in the elections and found those flaws made a material sort of impact on the results, the courts are not prepared to simply rubber stamp the process and say, let's just move on anyway, which unfortunately historically has been the case in other elections on the continent where there was sort of evidence of these types of irregularities that the Malawi courts have found. The fact that this is now the second court after Kenya in 2017 that has taken quite a bold step. I mean, it's a big step for the courts to go this far to annul a national election and reset the country back to the state it was before that election. That takes a lot of guts. And I think that in the past, what we've seen is that courts haven't been prepared to go that far. But Malawi has taken that step. And it really opens up a new frontier in the attempts to advance and deepen democracy on the continent.
I think also probably the respect for the separation of powers as well and the independence of the judiciary, because in this particular case with Malawi, for instance, last year after the elections, just before the Malawi Electoral Commission was about to announce the elections, the opposition party went to court, and it was the courts again that said, whoa, wait a bit, there are a few things that need to be fixed before you make that announcement.
Yeah, that's right. That was, I think, an opportunity missed by the Malawi Electoral Commission, because what happened was that on late on the Thursday, the injunction was secured to hold in abeyance the announcement of the results. And at that stage, already early indications were coming in that there may be something wrong with some of the results that were being accepted by the Malawi Electoral Commission. And the opposition parties went to court and said, no, there's something going on. We want time to look at this. We don't want them to announce. Unfortunately, the Malawi Electoral Commission took the view that they wanted to overturn that injunction, so they went to court again on Monday morning. They successfully had it overturned, and they immediately announced the results. In that interim period, the opportunity was there for the Malawi Electoral Commission to engage in stakeholder dialogues with all of those parties and really try and satisfy some of the concerns of the opposition parties. And so that was certainly an opportunity lost for the Malawi Electoral Commission, which may have, I'm not sure if it would have, but it may have headed off where we've actually come to in Malawi.
And now you have the Electoral Commission, which has its credibility dent as well. And also considering that even just after the elections, there was the arrest of one of the Malawi Electoral Commission agents who was arrested for results fraud and how he fiddled around with the numbers.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the combined irregularities, it makes sense why the courts viewed the conduct of the Malawi Electoral Commission in a very serious light, such a serious light that they were prepared to actually annul the results of the election. There was also this concerning incident where there was the Supreme Court of Malawi actually came out and said there is an attempt for people to actually bribe us as the judges, that there is this attempt to interfere in the judgment itself. That was a story that came out ahead of the judgment itself, and they actually declared there are people who are trying to influence us in this way. So
people from?
The declaration was that there was an individual in Malawi who had approached some of the judges in the court to try and influence the decision that the court was going to come to. That has been reported, and the case there will also have to be seen.
So looking at that particular court judgment and what the court also says about the credibility of the Electoral Commission, and also going as far as saying that Parliament will now have to decide whether this Electoral Commission should oversee the next election that's supposed to take place within 150 days.
Yeah. I think when we start to look at the implications of this judgment, I think there should be some concern. The judgment itself has been very bold, and it has a lot of positives that come out of this judgment. There are some things that I'm personally concerned about, and people I've been speaking to over the last 48 hours are increasingly growing concerned about. Some of them are to do with the issues you've just raised. The first one is that what we saw in Kenya in 2017 was that we had a rerun audit. In Kenya, the courts allowed for the 90 days between the two elections. The Electoral Commission in Kenya was exactly the same Electoral Commission that managed the first election. And I think perhaps one of the things at this point it's important to mention is that for almost all electoral commissions, not just in Africa, but around the world, the preparations for an election begin 2 or 3 years before the election itself. So 150 days may sound like a long time, but to organize a national election, that is not a long period of time at all. And so in the experience of Kenya, the second election that was held had additional problems on top of some of the original problems that were identified by the courts in Kenya. So one of the concerns here is, what is the second election really going to deliver that wasn't there in the first case? So there's one concern. The other concern, of course, is that we have a situation now where the credibility of the Malawi Electoral Commission itself has been tarnished by the courts. So where does that leave the Malawi Electoral Commission? Will they resign? And if they resign, who steps in with just 150 days of preparation time to run that election? So there are already some implications from this judgment which we should be turning our eyes to and be quite concerned about.
But then I think probably could it be that the judges were thinking about the level of suspicion that the electorate would have if the same electoral commission officers remain in office and oversee the next election? Because in the Kenyan example that you make, for instance, is that the Orange Party, Raila Odinga announced and said that I'm not going to be contesting the second run of these elections if those people remain in office. And yes, surely they did remain in office, and there was an election, and he said we're not contesting the election.
That's right. There was a boycott in Western Kenya. In fact, polling stations all throughout the west of Kenya didn't even open in the rerun elections. Odinga himself announced a boycott, and even electoral officials were threatened if they even opened stations in the west of Kenya there would be trouble in those areas. So what we saw is that although the idea of the rerun, although the slapdown for the irregularities that were seen in Kenya was cheered at the time, it creates a new set of problems. And because Kenya was the first instance and Malawi will be the second instance of such reruns, we have almost no experience of how these rerun elections actually go. But if we look at what happened in Kenya, we can see already that there are some big challenges, not just facing the Electoral Commission, but the entire country. And
also security, because in the Kenyan example, for instance, in Kibera, and I was covering the elections there, no electoral official were allowed to go into Kibera to the polling stations because people were saying that the Electoral Commission and the people who are in charge of running these elections cannot be trusted.
Yeah, correct. So now we have had these demonstrations in Malawi for a number of months now, which certainly have contributed to the situation we find ourselves in, where Malawians have said, no, we don't accept these results. And one of the battle cries that they have gone onto the streets with is that the chairperson of the Malawi Electoral Commission, Jane Ansah, must fall. That she must be removed by the president for her role in announcing these results that they didn't accept. Now, she is at present still the chairperson. She has not fallen on her sword. And of course, the question is, will she stay? Will she try and take the Malawi Electoral Commission into the next elections? And if so, what will the reaction be from the opposition parties who clearly don't trust her? What will the reaction from the citizens, the electorate, who are ultimately the people who need to have trust in this vital institution in the electoral process? Will they trust Jane Ansah and the current structures of the Malawi Electoral Commission to lead that election?
Uncharted waters, and I've seen one of the human rights organizations in Malawi has said that they are calling on people to take to the streets, and you hear from the opposition parties that are saying that no, the entire Electoral Commission should go.
Yeah, you know, given the rebuke that the courts have given, that would certainly make sense. I don't think anyone would be surprised if the Malawi Electoral Commission were to resign, or possibly there may even be a call for them to be removed. I'm not quite sure what the process for that particular thing would be, but it would likely have to do with the president himself. And of course, one of the other interesting dynamics that the resetting of Malawi to the state that it was in before the elections was concerned is that we have now people who ran against one another in His Excellency Peter Mutharika and his former Vice President Solos Chilima going back into government together at the order of the court to try and work out what will the legal framework be now for these new elections. So these are opponents who are now being put back together to try and work this out.
How does that even happen?
Well, we have no template for this, so it's a fascinating challenge. There is also discussion that seems to be emerging out of Malawi now at the possibility of some kind of coalition of the opposition forces, which is also problematic because in a rerun, at least the interpretations that I've spoken to people about is that if you redo the election, then all of the parties and all of the presidential candidates who registered should be included once again on the ballot. But now with the opposition parties talking about possibly aligning their interests behind a single candidate, and we'll see if that does come true, but there seems to be some interest in doing that. Certainly they would have the numbers, according to the previous polls, to give the president a big challenge. And there seems to be interest among the parties to have that. But how do they make that work? Because this is supposed to simply be a resetting and a redoing of the election. So do those kind of political maneuverings feature in a rerun election?
And we've heard now from the president actually indicating that he's now challenging the outcome of these elections because he believes that everything was above board. What does this then mean for governance within Malawi? And on top of that, the unrest from citizens who have taken to the streets.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a legal expert on Malawi, so I'd love to be able to tell you I know how that works, but we've been trying, my colleagues and I, to figure out today who does the president appeal to here, because we're talking about the apex court in Malawi. So how do you go to a court higher than the highest court in the land to appeal?
I saw some articles saying that the president can appeal to the Supreme Court, and I thought as well that the Constitutional Court would be the apex court. And I wonder, in terms of the hierarchy of the judiciary, where the Supreme Court will then be.
Yeah, I think at this stage I'm just speculating, but it is an interesting challenge, one that I'm still not quite sure about. But on to the other issue that you talked about there, about the potential for unrest. I think that this is also something that needs to be very carefully monitored. One positive sign thus far has been the conduct of the army, which we've seen in the recent months has been very supportive of ensuring that protesters and demonstrators are well protected. The army is not being unleashed on demonstrators to suppress their protests. It's actually been very encouraging to see the army playing this role of almost protecting the livelihood of the demonstrators and allowing them to demonstrate. And so that is a positive dynamic on with a perspective towards unrest. However, Malawi is divided into 3 regions, north, central and south. And in the south, where the president enjoys the vast majority of support, the mood is different. And the mood now is shocked at this annulment. And there is clearly growing anger already manifesting around Blantyre, where the president's support base is strong.
Could we see clashes between the 3 regions?
It's not clear at this stage. Malawi has been a very peaceful country ever since its independence. We haven't had any major armed conflicts or explosions of violence. But of course, we're again, as I keep emphasizing, in uncharted waters here. And the nature of the rerun, and certainly I think the fact that the president, the current president, who is president by dint of being the president before these elections, has said that he won the elections, there was no fraud. He's nailed his colours to the mast, saying he thought that these elections were good, and now the courts have, in essence, disputed that with him. He and his supporters feel as though his particular reputation has been tarnished by this as well.
And you were speaking now about the role that the military is currently playing in trying to protect these citizens, the ones who are protesting. But we saw was it just before the elections, for instance, that the president went to court and there was a court order banning protest.
Yep, and even since the demonstrations began, I was actually in Malawi when there were demonstrations planned at the border posts, and there were very real concerns that those protests at the borders might bring demonstrators too close proximity in with the army, and there would be clashes and maybe violence. Fortunately, those protests were suspended at the last minute, and they decided not to go ahead with those. So I think really a lot of credit needs to go to the citizens and the demonstrators in these demonstrations who have really stayed the course during what has been a lengthy process, during the trial, during the court case itself, really looking into the issues. They've stayed the course. They've maintained a peaceful demeanor by and large. There have been incidences of violence. There have been incidents of shootings and attacks. Hopefully those do not spread and do not escalate. But by and large, the demonstrations have maintained a degree of resolution, but they haven't been violent. They haven't degenerated as of yet.
Okay, so we're going to go to a quick ad break. When we come back, what we'll do is the same conversation continues, but let's now start questioning the role of external parties, the role that they played ahead of the elections, during the elections, and now post the elections and post this Constitutional Court judgment. What is it that they can do to ensure that there is no civil unrest within Malawi? And welcome back. We're still in conversation with Grant Masterson, speaking about what happened in Malawi following the Constitutional Court judgment that they nullified the 2019 election of Peter Mutharika, the president of Malawi, who now goes back to his previous position as the president ahead of the 2019 election. And Grant, let's start speaking about the role of election observers. They go into a country to do what exactly?
Well, there's no single answer to that question. Each observer group goes in with a specific objective in mind and a specific mandate from their members or from the organizations that back those observers. So, for example, the African Union's mandate, as you intimated earlier in your lead-in, is very much about observing elections to ensure that the guns are silenced, that elections do not lead to further outbreaks of violence or de-escalating stability in the country. So the African Union's observer missions are really there to ensure that peace and stability are maintained, whereas other organizations go in to look at the more technical aspects and produce technical reports primarily for the election management bodies and for other actors involved in running the elections. So there's a host of reasons why international observers conduct observation. But in essence, they are there to witness the polls, to see what happened in those polls, and to report on what they saw.
And what's the extent of that level of monitoring and observing? Because immediately after the Constitutional Court judgment, people then came out to say that, but listen, the Commonwealth Observer Group, for instance, came out and said that the elections were conducted in a professional manner. And this was a quote of former President Thabo Mbeki. You have the European Union as well, that endorsed the election outcomes. So what does this then mean about the role that they play in terms of observing the elections all the way through up until the announcement of the results?
Right. So I think that the opposition parties typically in the last sort of 2-3 electoral cycles have really started to view international observers in quite a cynical light. They've really started to believe that observer groups just come, they call them election tourists, they look around, they give a thumbs up, and they confer a degree of credibility to elections that opposition parties don't believe is warranted. In the case of Malawi, what happened particularly with the European Union is very interesting, because the only statement that you and I can publicly access right now is their preliminary statement. Now, that statement deals with the pre-election environment and election day itself. But why is there no final report? Well, in actual fact, the answer to that question is because the political parties concerned, particularly the parties of Solus Chalima, UTM, and Lazarus Chakwera's MCP party, said that the European Union was premature in releasing their final report until such time as the court case had determined what happened in the election.
But the report, I understand, is ready.
The report is ready. In fact, the European Union was prepared to present that report about a month and a half ago. And the UTM in particular said, no, we don't think this is appropriate. And they wrote a very strongly worded letter to the European Union saying, we do not welcome the release of this report. We believe that it is preempting court process.
So the role of these election tourists, here they come, the elections are announced, the president is then inaugurated, and then comes a Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court says, wait, everything was not done to the letter, and we are now setting aside these elections. Does this then mean that when it comes to vote counting, as well as the final announcement of the result, that there is a lapse in terms of the work that's being done by observer missions? Because they play a crucial role, certainly during, as you mentioned, for instance, pre-election, as well as during election day. But what about post-election day when the counting is happening.
Yeah. The European Union as well as the African Union, those are the two missions I know certainly had election monitors remain in the country throughout the counting process right up to the announcement of results. So observers do remain in the country for that post-election period. Now, the question that should be asked is why can those reports not be released? It was at the insistence of the parties themselves that said we've gone to court and any judgment by the European Union would be preempting this. We don't believe this report should be launched right now. But we therefore don't have the view of the European Union on this crucial aspect that the court has pronounced on. And so I think that that was possibly a mistake. At least if we had had the report, we could compare what the European Union believed with what the courts have found. It is, though, a big challenge for international observation because for good reasons, there is a very tight amount of security around the tabulation of results, the counting and the aggregation of the votes that come in from the stations. And it's very difficult for international observation groups to get access to that tabulation process in a way that doesn't start to interfere with the operations of the election management body. It's an ongoing issue. And given that the presence of international observers has displaced efforts at electoral fraud, and the most visible elements of irregularities are now occurring during this tabulation process. It's an area that international observers are really looking at very carefully. How can they track and monitor this particular aspect that we're talking about that was problematic in Malawi better?
Yeah, and what does this then say about the African Union article? I just forgot what the name of the article is that deals, for instance, with the governance as well as elections within member state countries.
Yes, the African governance architecture.
Exactly, that particular one. Does that then mean that there needs to be an amendment to some of those articles that would allow international observers, including or especially the African Union observer missions, as well as the various blocs on the continent, that they should have access to granular details relating to an election?
Look, I think that would certainly enhance the transparency of that particular element of the elections. In all cases, observer groups are the invited guests of the host nation holding the elections. So in all cases, observer groups come at the invitation, usually of the election management body or some government agency that issues the invitations for the observers. So observers are guests. And like any guest, they have to observe certain decorums and certain behaviors when they are in the country. So it's not a case of the AU needs to demand these things, but there can be a conversation at the AU level.
But the AU is already demanding those things.
Yes.
The AU is already demanding that there should be free and fair elections, that there should be regular cycles of elections. Why can't the AU demand that? There seems to be a loophole here and we need to tighten the screw.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly a conversation that is very appropriate at the African Union level to have that discussion between member states about, are we going to put more emphasis on this? The sad reality is in some cases the incumbent government has no desire to see more transparency in that tabulation process. And I think after this judgment there may be governments that will become even more fearful of increasing the transparency around their processes. Bear in mind, we're talking about African elections. We're talking about countries that often deal with huge areas of land, very sparse populations. One of the big issues in Malawi was the illiteracy rates in many areas of the country. The cost of elections is very high. There are a lot of challenges which impact on the accuracy with which the entire process is carried out. So in almost all cases where we observe elections, we see these irregularities, and now the challenge becomes, are these isolated irregularities or is it systemic? And in the case of Malawi, what the courts have decided is that it was of a significance enough of nature to have a huge impact on the election.
Does systemic mean deliberate?
It could. It's impossible to know whether it's deliberate or it's just widespread and real challenges. Electrification on the continent. Certainly Malawi struggles with that. As I said, literacy rates and the accuracy with which the forms are filled out, which explains in part why the people who are filling these forms out may have wanted to correct the forms, because so many mistakes are made. Not just in Malawi, all across the continent and even beyond the continent, I see those mistakes on the forms are made. And of course the question is, how widespread are those mistakes, and do they ultimately impact on the result?
What do you see if indeed the election there is a rerun of the elections in the 150 days? How do you see the various observer missions and the role that they could play and how they would be perceived by the electorate, including opposition parties?
It's tough. As I've said to you in the last couple of electoral cycles, certainly international observation has not been well received. And international observer groups have, I think, dropped the ball in some ways to justify some of that anger. Certainly in particular countries you go to, certain observer groups are not well received. For example, SADC is not particularly welcomed in Zimbabwe, given some of the judgments that they've made in the past. Civil society there doesn't enjoy the hearing that SADC is coming to observe elections, don't have great faith that they will do a good job there, which is really unfortunate. But citizens have a memory, and they remember what these observer groups say about their elections, and they know what they feel was the case in those elections as well. So we need to be mindful, not just international observers, but I think all stakeholders, of the frustrations of citizens who want to see democracy strengthened.
Just quickly, Grant, in closing, now that we have these talks of a possible, probably, government of national unity in Malawi, do you think that there's a role that the African Union can play in trying to mediate the outcomes of the negotiations that are currently taking place to ensure that there's no unrest?
I think I always like to see the African Union and the regional blocs where they are welcomed in the country playing that kind of mediation role. That's really the kind of role that we need to see, the kind of leadership we need to see from our blocs. Certainly the AU has been involved in Malawi. In the previous election, they had quite good technical support provided behind the scenes that made a material impact to some of the pre-election challenges the Malawi Electoral Commission faced. And I think that absolutely the AU can and should play a role both in ensuring that there isn't an escalation of any conflict and also trying to assist Malawi with what is going to be a huge task.
Thank you so much for your time. That was Grant Masterson from the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. We've come to the end of this evening's show. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back. Where's my words now? Ran out of words. We'll be back with you next week, same time, same place, right here on the SABC News Channel 404. Goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your evening.